50 years ago, on June 5th of 1967, the tiny nation of Israel launched a preemptive military strike against the three Arab nations bordering their tiny nation of just 2.5 million people. This was their fourth war in just 20 years. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and many other Arab nations had been publicly declaring how they were going to annihilate every Jewish child, woman, and man in Israel, to kill them all. That war only lasted a highly appropriate 6 days. All three nations had surrendered in humiliation by the end of that sixth day, despite having dramatically greater and more powerful military weapons provided by the Soviet Union, greater military funding, a vastly superior number of soldiers, and a murderous hatred for Israel and the Jewish people. But on the seventh day, after Israel's total victory, Israel rested, with no fear of being murdered in their sleep by their Arab neighbors. This war shocked the world. Almost universally, Israel was expected to be annihilated, but no one would come to their defense. Not the United States, not Britain, unlike the Suez Canal War in 1956, when Britain and France sent troops into that war as allies of Israel, although that was due to their commercial interests and not for the benefit of Israel. This six-day war has been endlessly studied by military students and historians all over the world due to the lightning speed of the unlikely Israeli victory and the series of mistake after mistake after mistake made by the three Arab nations that had promised the Arab community to wipe out the Jewish people from Palestine. We'll be considering some of this history and the invariably fortunate coincidences that brought about a swift and decisive victory that more than tripled Israeli territory. This war can be compared to other battles fought by the Jewish nation that are recorded in the Bible, both past and particularly one future battle, frequently referred to as Armageddon, identified due to the location of this still future battle. Then we'll consider the advance notice the Creator of heaven and earth has supplied to anyone willing to listen in the prophecies of the Bible that have both a direct application in relation to the Six-Day War and how events have played out over the last 120 years into a divinely orchestrated template designed to provide inspiration and confidence to any of the Creator's faithful who actually possess the great but rare benefit of what God's Son defines as seeing eyes and hearing ears, that unique capacity to ignore the winds, earthquakes, and raging fires of this life and the foolish, self-worshipping nature of society in order to hear the whispered, still, small voice of God. Gamal Abdul Nasser was the Egyptian president. He became president in 1956, but had led a military coup against the royal family in Egypt in 1952. Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal in the first few months of his presidency in 1956, prompting a war with Israel. Although Egypt lost, Nasser, rather counterintuitively, enjoyed a massive political victory with Arabs all over the Middle East. By 1967, he was calling for all Arab nations to unite in the complete destruction of Israel and the complete annihilation of all Jewish people in Palestine, every child, every woman, every man, young or old, healthy or infirm. This Hitler-like frame of reference made him extremely popular with Arabs all over the Middle East. He formed a military alliance with King Hussein in Jordan, actually having an Egyptian general placed in charge of the entire Jordanian military. His hate speech emboldened Arabs everywhere. One Syrian general made a public declaration that if he were given military control of all Arab armies, he would wipe out Israel in just 6 hours. In April of 1967, just less than 2 months from the war, the Syrians provoked the Israeli Air Force into a dogfight. 6 of the Russian MiG jet fighters of Syria were shot down, but not a single Israeli jet was lost in that battle in the sky. At that time, there was no Israeli television. If Israelis had televisions, they would have to watch Arab stations that were all calling for the annihilation of Israel. On May 14th of 1967, one of those fortunate events take place. Russia delivers intelligence to their Syrian and Egyptian allies that Israel military were deploying in large numbers at the Syrian border with an obvious intention to invade Syria. This is a lie, but both nations accept this as true. Nasser orders 4 army brigades to move into the Sinai to the border of Israel. Initially, 40,000 Egyptian reserves are called up to military duty. And over the next 3 weeks, 100,000 Egyptian soldiers, 900 Soviet-made tanks, and 1,000 artillery cannons are moved into Sinai. The next fortunate event is that less than a day after mobilizing his troops, Nasser learns that the Russian report of an imminent Israeli invasion of Syria is false, and there is no mobilizing of the Israeli army on their northern Syrian border. But Nasser refuses to back down. In fact, he provokes Israel with a virtual declaration of war by ordering the removal of the United Nations peacekeeping force from Sinai. The Secretary General of the UN, Utant, does not even ask for the Security Council's approval. He simply orders all his Middle East peacekeeping force to evacuate immediately. That had been the first peacekeeping force to ever be deployed by the United Nations, placed there following the end of the Suez Canal War. This gave Egypt complete control over the Straits of Tiran. The Egyptian military demanded that all ships headed to or from the Israeli port of Eilat be forbidden passage, shutting off 90% of Israel's oil imports. The Arab people across the Middle East demonstrate an absolute bloodlust for killing the Jewish people. Russia keeps telling Egypt not to start the war. President Johnson in the United States tells Israel not to start the war, but all he will do is to encourage Egypt to open the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. He also refuses to provide any military support to Israel's defense, unless, of course, Russia directly engages militarily through Syria and Egypt. 4 days before the war starts, Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister of Israel, resigns his post as defense minister due to the insistence of his generals after a disastrous live speech he gave earlier that day. Moshe Dayan, the military hero of the Suez Canal crisis, was appointed defense minister, and plans were put in place for Israel's first strike to start the war. 2 days before the war is scheduled to start, June 3rd, 1967, a Saturday, a Sabbath, Israel's soldiers are photographed vacationing in the waters of the Mediterranean. The impression is given that Israel is not planning to strike in the near future. On the morning of the 5th, June 5th, almost the entire Israeli Air Force takes off, headed first for Egypt, across the Mediterranean, with the hope of destroying their air superiority. There is another fortunate event. A Jordanian radar operator actually witnesses some Israeli jets taking off. He sends a coded message to the Egyptian military that the war has begun, that Israel is attacking. But Egypt had changed their communication protocols the day before, and with a new frequency and a new code. They had not notified the Jordan army and never received the warning. They were caught completely by surprise. The almost 200 Israeli jet fighters flew at 500 miles per hour, just 100 feet above the ground and water, out of radar range, so they might not be engaged by the formidable anti-aircraft weapons supplied by to Egypt by the Soviet Union. But yet another fortunate simultaneous event was that Arab leaders were reviewing the Egyptian military deployment in Sinai that morning. General Emir of Egypt had issued a warning that no anti-aircraft weapons were to fire without a direct order from the high command. The guns were silent. Not a single alert siren preceded the attack, and every single Egyptian military jet fighter and bomber were sitting on the ground that morning. Not a single airplane was in the air when 5 of their Air Force military bases were hit simultaneously by the Israeli Air Force, first taking out the runways to prevent any planes from taking off, and then picking off each aircraft. Another odd coincidence is that there was no wind that morning. There was nothing to divert the Israeli bombs from their targets that particular morning at all of those Egyptian military air bases. Within 3 hours, 280 Egyptian fighters and bombers and virtually 100% of their runways had been destroyed across their 11 air bases. In the next 2 hours, the Syrian Air Force is destroyed, and it only took a few minutes to cripple the Jordanian Air Force. 15 minutes after the first simultaneous Israeli attacks on the Egyptian Air Force, at 8 a.m. on June 5th, 1967, Israel launches its attack into the Sinai Peninsula with its tank brigades at 3 separate points. The order Red Sheet is given, and the Israeli tank formations race into the Sinai. Egypt has modern Soviet-supplied T-55 mid-range tanks. Israel has leftover World War II Sherman tanks that they have dramatically modified and outfitted them with custom treads that would allow them to travel over sand dunes where their enemies would never expect them to come from. They changed the guns out to give them a longer range capacity, with the ability to fire with accuracy from a greater distance than the Egyptian tanks. The Israeli tank commanders had an order: do not stop. Just keep going. After only 36 hours of fighting, the Egyptian army is given an immediate retreat order. They had lost 10,000 men and 700 tanks. The vastly outnumbered and outgunned Israelis had only lost 1,400 men and 60 tanks. The next fortunate event is that despite these humiliating defeats, Nasser actually boasts to Syria and Jordan and to the Egyptian people that Egypt is crushing Israel, that his people have shot down 23 Israeli jets and were advancing into Israel territory. Interestingly, Israel is not denying these false reports. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, had ordered complete radio silence in Israel. Not even the Jewish people knew of the incredible victories in the Sinai and the complete elimination of the 3 nations' air forces. The Israeli people, the Arabs, and the world think Israel is facing certain death due to these incredible lies. Israel is even jamming the radio communications of the Egyptians. Nasser advises King Hussein to send his troops into Israel in order to cut Israel in half by advancing to the Mediterranean Sea, which is less than 11 miles at one point between the Jordanian border and the seashore. Syria has reinforced Nasser's lying boasts about Israel's repeated defeats, and Israel warned Jordan to stay out of this war, and in turn, they would not attack Jordan. This was not the will of the Creator of heaven and earth. Jordan is drawn into the war by Nasser's boastful lies, so that they could avoid the embarrassment of not being part of the anticipated glorious Arab victory over the Jewish nation. Within a day, Jordan's attack is reversed into a panicked retreat. In the first 2 days of the war, Israel defeated Egypt in Sinai. In the next 2 days, they defeat Jordan and take over the West Bank, all the way to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. The Israeli paratroopers were ordered to leave the Sinai and return to Israel for the Jordanian military front centered at Jerusalem. In fairly short order, the Egyptian general in charge of the Jordanian military orders a retreat. The old city of Jerusalem then comes under Jewish control for the first time in about 2,000 years. An odd coincidence has been that the #1 hit song in Israel before that war began was called Jerusalem of Gold, and it's played constantly on the radio during the war. An interesting item in the defeat of Egypt and Jordan was how Nasser and Hussein came up with the idea of claiming their humiliating defeat before Israel on Americans and British, that they were going to claim that they were fighting for the Israelis. Now, the interesting part is that this phone call was taped by the Israelis, who were listening secretly to their phone calls. And this tape was shared with the USA and British in advance of those defensive sputterings of Nasser and Hussein. A U.S. diplomat responds to this orchestrated lie and is flatly told by Nasser that there is no possible way Israel could have this kind of success without help, and their belief was that help was coming from the Americans. Nasser was actually right about the support, but not the source. It wasn't the Americans or the British that were providing that incredible Israeli success. It was Yahweh, the Jewish and Christian God of the Bible, that was the unseen ally, ensuring not only a definitive Jewish victory, but in a highly appropriate 6 days, with extreme humiliation for their enemies, and a territory acquisition that would return their nation to borders very similar to their historical borders under their monarchy with kings such as Saul and David. Nasser wasn't wrong about a secret Israeli ally. He was just wrong about which ally. All that was left after Egypt's and Jordan's lightning defeats was Syria, with its formidable entrenchment in the Golan Heights, with battlements hidden all through the elevated rocky terrain. But years before, the most famous of all Israeli spies, Agent 088, Eli Cohen, had infiltrated the high command of the Syrians. He was a Jew that had grown up in Egypt, but he was actually a Mossad agent. Mossad is Israel's counterpart to America's CIA and Britain's MI6. Cohen had actually visited the Syrian artillery bunkers on the Golan Heights. He had recommended the Syrians plant shade trees around those trenches to give some relief to the Syrian soldiers from the severe summer sun. And the Syrians actually did plant trees, as they are still there today by these former Syrian artillery bunkers. Agent 088 had provided clear target identifications for the Israeli army, as there are not many trees in the Golan Heights. Sadly, Eli Cohen was discovered 2 years before the 1967 war, sending a coded radio message to the Mossad from his home in Damascus. He was tortured, interrogated, publicly hung on Syrian television before the Mossad could launch a rescue mission. Agent 088 had no exploding pens or cars to become submarines or jet packs. His execution was celebrated by Arabs everywhere. But his intelligence gathering for the Israeli IDF had been crucial in their success in the Six-Day War 2 years after his death. With the similarly lightning-fast defeat of the Syrians and the capture of the Golan Heights by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces advanced within 40 miles of Damascus, the Syrian capital city. Now, what happens next is equally miraculously fortunate, at least from the perspective of God's will. Israel is willing to return the captured territory for a promise of peace and no more aggression from the Arab nations. The Arabs actually refuse. It was that refusal of the Arab leaders meeting at Khartoum, Sudan in late August of 1967 that actually created the Palestinian refugee crisis. Israel offered back the lands they had taken in exchange for peace. This was promoted by both the Americans and the Soviet Union. The Arab leaders responded with 3 definite no's. No recognition of Israel as a political entity with any right of sovereignty. No peace with Israel. No negotiations with Israel. Amazingly, Israel is forced to keep the territory they had won. Even in abject, humiliating defeat, there is no peace even imagined with Israel. The Palestinian refugee situation that is blamed on Israel today was actually prompted by the refusal of the Arab nations to take back the land that they had lost. And of course, the Soviet Union immediately started restocking Egypt and Syria with military weapons, even shipping 200 crated MiG fighter jets to Egypt following the war. This war, 1967, is very similar to other wars and battles described in the Bible, like where a single man, armed with only the jawbone of a donkey, is able to kill 1,000 Philistine soldiers that had come to take Samson prisoner. The 1967 war is similar to how a huge Assyrian army was besieging Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah. But one morning, they wake up to find 185,000 of their fellow soldiers had died in their sleep during the night. They too retreat, completely humiliated, back to Assyria. The Six-Day War also is reminiscent of when another 3 neighboring nations of Judah come to completely destroy the Jewish nation during the reign of Jehoshaphat. These were Ammon, Moab, and the Ishmaelites of Mount Seir, which would be almost the same borders of 1967 of southwest and northwest. Israel is prophetically instructed to simply go out and meet the invading armies and witness God's defeat of these armies. By the time the Jewish people arrive at the wilderness watchtower at Tekoa, they see the 3 armies, all dead on the ground in front of them, having attacked each other. Just like in 1967, the Jews take the spoils of their enemies who wanted to kill them and take their land. It takes 3 days just to transport the wealth from the dead bodies and camp of these 3 armies back to Jerusalem. The miraculous victory of the nation of Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967 was not really anything new. It was certainly shocking to the whole world 50 years ago, but it wasn't unprecedented in the history of the Jewish nation. So, what does all this have to do with the testimony of the Creator of heaven and earth that can be easily found in the Bible without much difficulty at all for anyone that cares to see with seeing eyes and hear with hearing ears? God made it clear in repeated prophecies that the resurrection from the dead of the Jewish nation of Israel would be the sign identifying the generation when he would send his resurrected Son back to earth and require full global enlightenment and political submission to his son's authority, beginning at Jerusalem. Just 2 days before Passover, when Jesus was to die, he offered detailed prophecies to 4 of his closest disciples on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount across from the Kidron Valley at Jerusalem. They had asked questions about when the temple was to be destroyed and when Jesus would take political control. In that context, Jesus presented a parable about the death and the resurrection and flourishing of the nation of Israel. In Matthew 24, starting in verse 32, we read the words that Jesus gave to his disciples. He says, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise you, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." End quote. Well, the Bible can easily interpret itself. The fig tree is a biblical icon for the nation of Israel, similarly to how we identify the USA with an eagle, Russia with a bear, and Great Britain with a lion. Jesus declared that when that national fig tree of Israel would not only reemerge from the death of winter into the rebirth of spring, but actually begin to flourish, that the generation witnessing this would not pass away until everything he had foretold to those 2 sets of 2 brothers 2 days before his death would come true. By prophesying of the spring-like rebirth of the nation, Jesus was presuming the nation's winter-like death. Jesus confirms that understanding with his concluding statement about the passing away of the nation. Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away." Well, heaven and earth is another form of identification for the nation of Israel that is used very extensively all through Scripture, beginning with God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the dust of the earth. Heaven and earth, all the way through to Peter's prophecy of the destruction of the heaven and earth nation in 2 Peter chapter 3. This rebirth and reflourishing of the Jewish nation of Israel, serving as the timestamp for the generation when God would take direct control of the political operations of mankind on the earth through his Son, was nothing new. Jesus was just referencing the testimony of God's prophets from hundreds of years before. Jeremiah had prophesied in chapter 30 how the Jewish people would be called back to the promised land again from all nations, therefore not referring to simply the Babylonian return. The prophet's concluding statement in that chapter is, chapter 30, verse 24, "The fierce anger of the Lord shall not return until he have done it, until he have performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days you shall consider it." Now it should be understood that the Hebrew word, poorly translated here as latter, is akarit, which is most often translated as end, last, and hindermost. This prophecy of the restoration of the Jewish nation of Israel identifies the last generation, the end generation, what the Bible refers to so often as the time of the end, meaning the end of mankind's freedom for self-determination and self-rule, and the end of their preferred ignorance of divine truths. In Psalm 102, we can read how the hopelessness of the Jewish people, suffering through their global persecution, would be reversed when God would arise and have mercy upon Zion, meaning Israel, and particularly Jerusalem, where Mount Zion is. In verse 16 of Psalm 102, we read, "When the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory." This building up is referencing the same flourishing of the national fig tree the Son of God used in his Mount Olivet prophecy. Not simply the rebirth of the nation, but its actual flourishing or building up. In verse 18 of Psalm 102, we see the same exact time stamp that Jesus references on the Mount of Olives. This shall be written for the generation to come, and the people which shall be created shall praise the Lord. The Hebrew word, intentionally mistranslated as to come, as in the generation to come, is acharon, primarily translated throughout the Old Testament as end, utmost, hindermost, uttermost. This favoring of Israel is not a sign for some generation to come, but for the last generation. The same generation Jesus referenced that would witness not simply the rebirth of the national fig tree, but its flourishing. When Jesus, as he declares in his Mount of Olives prophecy, that generation that will witness this, his coming in the clouds of heaven, with great power and glory. Same timestamp. So let's access the most detailed Bible prophecy of the resurrection and flourishing of the nation of Israel, and see how it fits into the Six-Day War in 1967. When the Jewish people had been deported from their two nations, both Israel and Judah, by the Assyrians, Babylonians, and eventually the Romans, but at that time by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the prophet Ezekiel was chosen by God to offer them hope in a series of prophetic revelations. Chapters 35 through 48 of the book of Ezekiel explain how the Jewish people, and particularly their nation, would eventually be saved from their enemies, and how a new world order will be established with God's Son as the highest global political authority. Currently, our generation sits between the two prophecies about the valley of dry bones presented in Ezekiel in chapter 37. We can read that prophecy in Ezekiel 37, beginning at verse 1. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley, which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about, and behold, they were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, a shaking. And the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Now this is exactly where we are at this moment in God's timetable as presented by the prophet Ezekiel. The next verse presents events that have not taken place yet. The next 6 verses prophesy events yet to take place, describing the second resurrection stage in the nation of Israel, when their spiritual repentance will take place before their Messiah, that they will learn is actually Jesus of Nazareth, witnessing the holes in his hands, the spear mark still left in his body, as described by the prophet Zechariah in reference to a war in Israel that also has yet to happen, what is often referred to as Armageddon. This is the prophecy that is also presented in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. But that's not our subject for today. Our point of reference is the miraculous Six-Day War, when the reborn nation of Israel, in the same geographical coordinates with the actual descendants of the original residents expelled from Palestine in 135 of the Common Era by the Roman Emperor Hadrian following the Bar Kokhba revolt, speaking the same Jewish language that no nation has spoken in almost 2 millenniums, and as of the highly scriptural significant year of 1967, possessing the same capital city of Jerusalem. No people in the history of mankind had ever achieved such a vindication and recovery, such a resurrection that was predicted by so many Bible prophets in extreme detail. Let's just put Ezekiel's resurrection prophecy in the context of 1967's Six-Day War. Ezekiel presents a four-stage political reconstruction described as first, a skeletal reassembly, second, the addition of sinew, thirdly, flesh, and fourthly, skin. We read in verses 7 and 8 of that same chapter. Again, so I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold a shaking, and one, the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, two, the sinews, and three, the flesh came up upon them, and four, the skin covered them above. But there was no breath in them. That is exactly how the flourishing of Israel happened over the 4 wars of the Jewish nation, over the 20 years from the beginning of the War of Independence in November of 1947 to the Six-Day War in 1967. That skeletal reassembly was realized in Israel's War of Independence that began immediately after the unexpected United Nations successful vote to partition Palestine into both a Jewish and an Arab state. Britain had obviously assumed the Soviet Union would use their veto power on the Executive Council to squash the idea of a Jewish state, leaving them free to crush the Jewish presumption that England would actually fulfill their Balfour Declaration promise to create a Jewish state. The whole world was stunned when the Soviet Union voted in favor of establishing the rebirth of the Jewish nation, which coincidentally embarrassed Great Britain rather significantly. That second sinew addition to the national Jewish skeleton would be demonstrated in the second recognized War of Reprisals, running from about 1950 to 1960, when Israel demonstrated a policy of maximum bloodshed in response to the terrorist incursions into Israel by the Fedayeen from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, targeting both innocent civilians and Israeli soldiers. Israel expected the high blood cost that they would exact for these attacks would deter future attacks. But they underestimated the Arab perception of value for their own people. The third flesh addition stage in Ezekiel's prophecy corresponds perfectly to the war identified with the Suez Canal crisis in October of 1956, running through March of 1957, when Israel returned control of the occupied territory due to pressure from the USA and Soviet Union. After all, there was one more stage: the addition of the skin. Before the 4-stage 20-year prophecy would be fulfilled, before the flourishing of the resurrected nation would qualify to identify the last generation of divine accommodation for optional religious self-delusion and political self-determination. That generation that would witness the flourishing of the national Israelite fig tree and see the favoring of Zion, and the fourth reconstruction stage in Ezekiel's prophecy of the first of the 2 stages of the resurrection of the Jewish nation of Israel. That fourth skin addition in Ezekiel's prophecy corresponds perfectly to the 4th war of Israel, the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel was not even allowed to return the territories that they had won so quickly and in such a miraculous fashion. Now let's access more of that value that is filtered by God only to those within the enlightened community possessing seeing eyes and hearing ears. One might presume that God should act like all the commercial publicists in our world today, dramatically overemphasizing his providential activity in the world today in order to develop the greatest response within the human race. But he actually does the exact opposite. He hides the great volume of his evidence and testimony for the exclusive value of a very few within mankind, those he is developing to be his saints, the bride of his Son, from within the enlightened community. God's focus in his layered and intentionally complex testimony is developing quality among a few people and not quantity among many people. While he states clearly he would prefer all men to come to a knowledge of his truths and principles, in Timothy, Paul's letter to Timothy, that preference does not diminish his primary goal for developing quality, evidenced by his invariable communication policy of intentional complexity. It's just about the 50th year anniversary of that skin addition to the reconstructed bodies on that valley floor. That 6-day war of 1967, from June 5th to June 10th. So, how would a 50-year anniversary be somehow significant to those few in this world in which our Creator is trying to develop that greater quality and faithful confidence in his plan that prompts behavior that is honorable to the terms of his righteousness? It's just, is it just this golden anniversary application that the societies of this world can easily understand? Or is there something more? Divine law certainly provides a precedent for a 50-year period. This is called a jubilee under the laws of the first kingdom of God that was established at Mount Sinai under Moses. That kingdom of God, for which we have been identified as the generation that will witness its restoration. We read in Leviticus 25, starting at verse 8, "And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, and it shall be a jubilee unto you. And you shall return every man unto his possession, and you shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. You shall not sow, neither reap that which grows of itself in it, neither gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the jubilee. It shall be holy unto you. You shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. In the year of this jubilee you shall return every man unto his possession." 50 years was the term of a jubilee under the laws of God during his first kingdom. So how does this somehow provide value to the truly faithful within the enlightened community in this last, clearly defined generation that will witness the return of the Son of God and his political dominance of the entire world? Well, do we see this 50-year jubilee divine pattern repeating itself in recent history? Since this 50-year period is supposed to project Jewish freedom, Jewish liberty, the returning to Jewish ancestral lands, perhaps we should take a brief look at history to see if there was some kind of divine precedent for that 1967 timestamp of that incredible 6-day war that resulted in Jewish freedom, Jewish liberty, and the return to ancestral Jewish lands. Well, 50 years before 1967 would be 1917. It's as simple as subtracting 50 years from 1967. And that was World War I, when Great Britain took political control of Palestine away from the Turks, and then issued what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This was an official letter from the government of Great Britain, sent by British Secretary Arthur Balfour to Walter Rothschild, and intended for the Zionist organization that had been formed in 1897, declaring the intention of the British government to sponsor the formation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It was the invitation, the promise of freedom and liberty to the Jewish people and a return to ancestral lands. Was it just a coincidence that the absolute fulfillment was 50 years later, that Jubilee year term? So, would there be yet more subtle evidence in this pattern that is available for the exclusive review of those who are faithful among the enlightened community, those who possess the seeing eyes and hearing ears that are so rare? Absolutely. History records the very unexpected United Nations vote in November of 1947, determining the creation of both the Jewish and Arab states in Palestine. Britain had become increasingly frustrated with the Jewish impatience concerning their reversal of the Lord Balfour promise for establishing a Jewish state. The three Jewish paramilitary organizations of the Haganah, led by David Ben-Gurion, the Irgun Gang, led by Menachem Begin, and the Stern Gang, founded by Abraham Stern, had all delivered different degrees of passive and violent resistance to the British refusal to surrender any control of Palestine. It's presumed that Britain submitted the question of Palestine to the United Nations with the logical presumption that the Soviet Union, known as Russia today, would never agree to a Jewish state, and Britain would be free to crush the Jewish resistance to their supposedly benevolent management, being freed from the pressures of world scrutiny. The Soviet Union shocked Britain and their allies in the Middle East, and the Jewish people, and the United States by agreeing to a Jewish state. Now, they probably thought they would enjoy a double victory. First, the global embarrassment of Great Britain in this vote, opposed to their determined plan to continue controlling Palestine, and the presumed impossibility of a Jewish state due to the Arab intention of annihilating every Jewish baby, child, woman, man in Palestine. Russia probably thought, how could they lose? Probably the exact same foolishness they demonstrated in backing Egypt and Syria in the Six-Day War, a very appropriate 50 years later. Doubling this Jubilee 50-year divinely appointed application can be seen between the First Zionist Convention in Basel, Switzerland in August of 1897 and the United Nations vote to create a Jewish state in 1947, which immediately started that Jewish War of Independence, resulting in the new Jewish state of Israel on May 15th of 1948, when President Truman sent America's recognition of the State of Israel at 6:11 p.m. Washington time, but 12:11 in Israel, by telegram on May 14th. Truman did this in defiance of his cabinet that had threatened him with impeachment if he actually recognized the State of Israel. One might wonder why Jerusalem was not captured at the conclusion of the War of Independence in the summer of 1948. In fact, the Jewish people were quite confident they would possess Jerusalem on the evening just before the agreed ceasefire. They believed all they had to do was get through the wall and enter the old city, and the city would be theirs. A 300-pound bomb, called the Konus, designed by an Israeli physicist named Joel Rakah, was carried up Mount Zion in the dark, under enemy fire from the Jerusalem walls, to place the bomb under the wall. When the bomb exploded, there was an incredible flash of light that shot up into the night sky. There was smoke everywhere. The soldiers rushed forward to take the city. But the wall was completely intact. There was a huge black mark on the wall, but the 300 pounds of explosives that should have ripped that wall to pebbles had only smudged the walls. It would be 19 years more before the Jewish people would take Jerusalem so very quickly in that 6-day war. It was the Creator's will that 1967 would be the appropriate time, the ending of the times of the Gentiles, when the Gentiles would no longer oppressively rule the city where the Creator had invested his name about 3,000 years before. There have been wars in Israel since 1967, but there's still one final Israeli war that is prophesied in the Bible. The prophet Ezekiel tells us about this in chapters 38 and 39, about this war. There will be 6 protagonists this time, not 3, as in 1967. According to the prophet, they will be Russia, Persia, which is now Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, and what Ezekiel defines as Gomer and Togarmah, which would be European nations due to their scriptural identifications. Ezekiel and Zechariah both describe this war fought around Jerusalem with extreme numbers of Jewish casualties. 2/3 of the residents of Jerusalem will be butchered by this Russian-led Gang of 6. But both the prophets Ezekiel and Zechariah foretell of the intervention of the recently returned from heaven Son of God, leading the recently immortalized saints against these 6 Confederate nations, butchering the Jews at Jerusalem. Interestingly, we see the exact same distancing of America and Great Britain from this war as was demonstrated in the War of Independence in 1947 and 48, and also the 6-Day War. Ezekiel tells us in chapter 38 and verse 13, "The merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? To carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil?" The merchants of Tarshish constitute the British Indian influence. The younger lions of Britain would be the United States, Australia, Canada, and of course India. These nations will stand by, offering only rhetoric, just like 1947-48, just like in 1967. But again, Israel will not be destroyed by its enemies. Jesus Christ will use the weapons of creation placed under his control to destroy the enemies of Israel. He will verbally command earthquakes and volcanoes and lightning and disease, which will incite panic among those soldiers drunk with bloodlust butchering the Jewish people. Ezekiel declares that 83%, 5/6, of that 6-nation confederacy will be destroyed by the weapons of nature that the Son of God will unleash upon them. No tanks or fighter jets or bombers or attack helicopters or artillery fire will have any effect on Jesus Christ and the recently immortalized saints accompanying him. The incredible series of events during the 6-Day War of 1967 fit perfectly into the patterns of God's plan, leading up to that war and offering validation to the few truly faithful on this earth to ensure the fulfillment of the subsequent prophecies. The only real question facing each of us now is whether or not we will be among those immortalized saints, accompanying Jesus when he defeats the Gogian Gang of 6 at Armageddon sometime in the future within our particular generation.